Hello everyone. Today I'm going to share with you an incredible experience that happened recently. What seemed to be just an ordinary friendship took a completely unexpected turn. At the center of this story is my best friend, whose unusual invitation completely changed the way we relate to each other. I'm going to tell you how I found myself involved in a different relationship alongside her and her partner. Sophie had learned to like silence. At the age of 30, her routine in Little Germany, New York, was marked by predictability. Strong coffee in the morning, crowded subways, and endless hours organizing displays and dealing with hurried customers in the store where she was a supervisor. Her polite smile hid the weight of choices that had led her to a comfortable isolation. After loves broken by lies and empty promises, Sophie decided that her peace was worth more than any romance. She lived alone, but she didn't complain. When she returned to her small, simply decorated apartment, a book and a glass of wine were her most faithful companions. The evenings were quiet, but sometimes too quiet. Although she denied it, a part of Sophie still missed something she couldn't name, something to break the monotony, to make her believe again that it was worth taking risks. The silence in the apartment was broken only by the sound of her cell phone vibrating. Sophie looked at the screen and saw Emily's message, an invitation to dinner at the weekend. Emily always made a point of including her, as if to break her out of her isolation. Sophie accepted with a discreet smile, even though she knew that next to Emily and Jake, she would feel the same contrast as always. Emily was everything Sophie wasn't. Outgoing, full of energy, radiant. Married to Jake for 6 years, she led a life that seemed straight out of a movie. Travel, laughter, happy photos. Their harmony was almost disconcerting. Jake, with his calm and assured manner, completed Emily like a perfectly fitted piece. Even though she admired their relationship, Sophie couldn't help feeling that it was out of place. Still, something about the way Emily insisted on bringing her closer always made her give in. Over dinner, as Emily made weekend plans with her usual excitement, Sophie found herself remembering how everything between them had started. Years ago, Sophie was in a relationship that, at the time, seemed promising, but ended in betrayal and shame. She still remembered the afternoon when Emily showed up at her workplace, her face marked by the tension of someone who needed to say something important. Sophie barely knew her at the time, but Emily was direct and honest. She told her that she had seen Sophie's then-boyfriend in a restaurant with another woman, in a scene that left no doubt about the betrayal. A confrontation, a breakup, or even estrangement was expected, but instead, a bond was born. Emily not only revealed the truth, but stood by Sophie on the hardest days, encouraging her not to blame herself and to see her strength. That disarming sincerity, free of any judgment, touched Sophie in a way she had never experienced before. It was the beginning of a friendship that, over the years, has become one of the most solid pillars of her life. Emily, with her outgoing personality, balanced Sophie's introverted and reserved manner. Over time, this difference became a strong point between them. And Jake, when he appeared in Emily's life, seemed to embrace this dynamic as if Sophie had always been part of the trio. Now, at the dinner table, Sophie reflected on how a moment of pain had turned into a bond she could never imagine losing. As they sipped coffee on a sunny afternoon, Emily dropped the casual invitation like someone talking about something routine. "You need to come on Saturday. We're having a barbecue, just the three of us. Jake's excited to show off the new recipes he's learned." Sophie smiled a little hesitantly, but eventually agreed. Despite her natural resistance to social gatherings, she rarely refused Emily's invitations. When she arrived at the couple's home, she was greeted by the usual warm energy. Emily excitedly carried plates out to the backyard, while Jake fiddled with the grill, commenting on cuts of meat with the same attention he paid to everything he did. The music was low, the lights cozy, and the conversation flowed easily. Sophie, as always, felt welcome. As the night progressed, however, something began to change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Sophie noticed. Emily and Jake exchanged glances that seemed to carry some veiled meaning, something she couldn't decipher. When Emily sat down next to Sophie on the sofa, their proximity seemed more deliberate than usual. Jake, on the other side of the room, watched with a slight smile that Sophie couldn't interpret. She tried to ignore the sensations that arose, telling herself that she was being paranoid. But the small gestures, the quick touches, the way the conversations between the three of them seemed more charged with intent than before. created a tension that Sophie didn't know how to deal with. It was as if something was being said without words, something that Sophie wasn't yet ready to understand. The hours went by, lulled by the slow rhythm of the music and the gentle heat of the barbecue that still lit up the backyard. Sophie held her glass of wine, already on her second round, while Emily, as animated as ever, recalled stories of the trips she and Jake had taken over the last few years. There was easy laughter and moments of relaxation, but at the same time, Sophie felt a kind of intensity in the air, an energy she couldn't ignore. That's when the conversation took a different turn. Between sips of wine, Emily asked, "Sophie, have you ever stopped to think about how a few choices can change everything in our lives?" Sophie, curious, replied with a slight smile, trying to understand where this was going. Jake, on the other side of the table, just watched her, calmly, as if waiting for the conversation to unfold. Emily continued, now with a more serious tone, but still full of her usual naturalness. "Jake and I have talked a lot about how life can be richer when we're open to the new. Well, we trust you a lot. We thought that maybe you could be part of that." The words, although clear, left Sophie confused for a few seconds. "Part of what?" she asked, trying to decipher the glances that Emily and Jake quickly exchanged. Emily leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to break through an invisible barrier. Something more intimate, more connected, something that transcends who we are today. Sophie felt her face heat up, both from the wine and the impact of the words. The layers of ambiguity in the conversation began to dissipate, revealing intentions that left her speechless. It was an invitation, yes, but far beyond anything Sophie had expected to hear that evening. The invitation hung in the air, transforming the lightness of the evening into something dense and full of meaning. Sophie, who had always prided herself on keeping everything under control, felt the weight of those words pressing down on her thoughts. Emily and Jake looked at her with a disconcerting serenity, as if they had rehearsed every detail of that conversation. Sophie, however, couldn't hide the confusion growing in her chest. On the way home, the silence of the cab seemed to amplify the questions in her mind. Her friendship with Emily was one of the few constants in her life. What if everything changed? What if she accepted and it created an irreversible chasm between them? On the other hand, Sophie couldn't ignore the curiosity that had been aroused. The way Emily had spoken, with a mixture of confidence and vulnerability, kept echoing in her head. Something in her wanted to understand more, wanted to know why she had been chosen for something so intimate. However, the risks were undeniable. Sophie knew that things could get out of hand, and control was what she did best. The fear of losing the balance she had achieved, however small, made her hesitate. But at the same time, there was a spark of something new, something she couldn't define. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, with the chance to jump and fly or fall into free fall. As she lay that night, Sophie stared at the ceiling, motionless. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her confusion. Inside, however, she already knew that the choice would not be as simple as she would have liked. Sophie couldn't sleep properly that night. Emily's words echoed in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to push the thoughts away, they kept pulling her back to the same scene. The following Saturday, she returned to Emily and Jake's house, this time with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. She tried to act naturally, but it only took a few minutes to realize that the dynamic between them had changed, albeit subtly. Emily seemed more attentive to Sophie, her glances longer, her gestures a little more intimate. Jake, always discreet, showed a silent complicity, as if he was following every interaction between them in a calculated way, but without ever seeming invasive. Sophie realized how connected the three of them were in that space. A casual conversation on the sofa turned into shared laughter, and at one point, Emily leaned her head on Sophie's shoulder, in a natural way, but loaded with something Sophie couldn't define. Small gestures were weaving a new kind of intimacy. Emily's hands lightly touched Sophie's as they poured wine, and Jake made a point of including her in every joke or comment, with a naturalness that seemed almost rehearsed. Sophie felt the tension growing, an inexplicable energy that made the air seem thicker. There was something there, something undeniable, that made her feel conflicted. Part of her wanted to back off, to keep the line clear between friendship and anything else. Another part, however, wondered what it would be like to cross that line. For the next week, Sophie was on an emotional roller coaster. Her thoughts oscillated between the desire to say yes and the fear of the consequences. Every time she tried to rationalize, the memory of the trust in Emily and Jake's eyes came back to her. They hadn't insisted or pressured her. They had simply left the proposal in the air, giving her the space to decide. This attitude, paradoxically, made Sophie feel even more inclined to accept. Sitting in her apartment, with her third glass of wine on the table and her cell phone in hand, she finally made up her mind. With a deep sigh, she typed a message to Emily, short and to the point, but full of emotion. "I trust you." The message was sent instantly, and even without an immediate reply, Sophie felt a surprising sense of relief, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. On Saturday, when she arrived at Emily and Jake's house, the atmosphere seemed more intimate than ever. The soft lighting, the low music, and the scent of red wine created a welcoming atmosphere. Emily opened the door with a warm smile, hugging Sophie tightly, as if silently thanking her for her presence. Jake appeared soon after, calm and confident, but with a different sparkle in his eyes, as if he knew what the evening meant. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling strangely ready for what was to come. For the first time in a long time, she decided to lower the barriers she had built around herself. She didn't know where that choice would lead her, but something in her heart told her that, with Emily and Jake, she was safe to find out. The evening began with laughter and light conversation, but the atmosphere quickly took on a different depth. Every gesture, every exchange of glances, seemed to carry a meaning that went beyond words. Sophie felt that something was changing, as if the invisible barriers that had always kept the trio in their respective comfort zones were slowly dissolving. Emily led the evening naturally, telling stories, causing laughter, but there was a tenderness in her gestures that made it clear that this was not going to be an ordinary evening. Jake, always observant, maintained a subtle balance between participating and watching, as if to ensure that everyone was at ease. When the touches began, they were timid, almost accidental, but they soon became more intentional, creating a complicity that Sophie had never experienced before. In that space, where time seemed suspended, she allowed herself to be vulnerable in a way she had never imagined. The previously solid friendship transcended its limits and took on a new, deeper, more complex and intensely human form. The next morning, as the soft sunlight filtered through the curtains, Sophie remained silent, reflecting on everything that had happened. The weight of her doubts had dissipated, giving way to an unexpected sense of peace. It wasn't just about what they had experienced that night, but about what it represented. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt truly connected, not just with Emily and Jake, but with herself. She realized that what scared her most wasn't crossing boundaries, but allowing herself to trust so fully. Emily and Jake, with their careful and sincere attitudes, had shown her that trust didn't mean exposing oneself to risk, but sharing a safe space. Their friendship had not been weakened. On the contrary, it was stronger, more solid, because it now carried a new dimension of understanding and respect. For Sophie, this experience was not just about exploring something new, but about breaking down the walls she had built around herself. As she ate her breakfast, Sophie stared at the window, lost in thought. The night before seemed distant, like a dream too clear to ignore. However, what surprised her most was not the intensity of the experience, but the clarity of what she felt now. Far from damaging their friendship, it had deepened the bond she shared with Emily and Jake. They hadn't crossed a line to break it, but to build something new, something more solid. Every gesture, every word exchanged was confirmation that the respect and care that bound them together remained intact. Sophie felt closer to them than ever, as if they had reached a level of understanding that transcended any conventional definition of friendship. When she received a casual message from Emily, inviting her to Sunday brunch, Sophie smiled. There was no strangeness or distance. There was trust, and as she read it, she knew that a new chapter had begun, one that she was ready to write alongside them. Sophie couldn't help but smile as she listened to Emily describe their new house on the beach. It was a little hideaway by the sea, with large windows that let the sound of the waves fill every corner. Jake, with his characteristic discreet enthusiasm, showed her photos on his cell phone, pointing out details of the renovation they were planning. "We want it to be a place to relax, but also to share with those who are important to us," he said, casting a meaningful glance at Sophie. Emily, always vibrant, added with contagious excitement, You need to spend a weekend there with us. I've even imagined a room for you, decorated in your own style. It's going to be incredible." Sophie, still getting used to the recent changes in her dynamic with the couple, felt a warmth in her chest. It wasn't just an invitation to travel. It was an invitation to continue being part of their lives. As Emily detailed the plans and Jake made notes on a pad, Sophie realized that the trio were looking to the future. The beach house was not just a physical space, but a symbol of new possibilities, adventures, and the continuity of a bond that no longer followed conventional friendship rules. Sophie, for the first time in years, felt that she belonged to something bigger than herself. As the train headed towards Little Germany, Sophie watched the scenery out of the window, lost in her thoughts. The new house on the beach, the moments shared with Emily and Jake, all of it seemed so far removed from the life she had led months ago. It was as if a portal had been opened, revealing a version of life she had never imagined existed. Sophie had always believed that protecting herself was the only way to avoid further disappointment, but this journey made her see something new. By confiding in Emily and Jake, she not only challenged her own limits, but also discovered that the world beyond her barriers was surprisingly welcoming. The isolation that had once been her refuge now felt like a cage that she had finally learned to leave behind. As the season approached, Sophie felt a slight smile forming. For the first time, she saw her own story not as a succession of losses, but as a path of transformation. Life, with all its risks, was far greater than she had ever allowed it to be.
This story doesn't end here. Listen to it all by clicking on the exclusive playlist on the right, or click on the video on the left and listen to the best story on the channel.